Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining what is both the first one of our discussion series and the launch event of our network, Relate. It's a UACES network that will run from today, this year, 2022 to June 2025. So lots of stuff to do and lots of time to do it. She said now, and then I'm sure time will fly so quickly. But I'm gonna introduce what we are in, 2 sentences, and then pass the ball on to Heidi, who's another one with Hannah and the rest of our coordination team that will get introduced in a second, who's sort of behind the scenes of the network. So I'll briefly introduce myself. So my name is Marianna. You'll probably have received an email from me or seen my name at some point. One of the leaders of the network. I'm a PhD candidate at University College Dublin. I put together this network, or the idea for this network, with Heidi and Anna, and then Nick, Carlos, and Sharon gracefully joined. And the idea really is to try and bring social relational approaches and studies into the mainstream of European studies, and to foster a community, as you can see, of like-minded senior, mid, and early career scholars, and bring together sort of conceptual, theoretical approaches and expertise with methodological rigor. So really the idea here is to just share expertise and get network members to really take out and as much as they can from the network. But without further ado, let me pass it on to our dear Heidi, whom I'm sure is very well known to most of you, for the rest of our brief introduction.
Thank you very much, Marianna. And good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to see many familiar faces, but also a lot of new names. So I think from my side, we already ticked the first box in bringing together a wider community of people interested in relational approaches. My name is Heidi Maurer. I'm a researcher at the Danube-Krems University in Krems. And together with Marianna and Anna, we put in this bid for the UACES network. So you already met Marianna. Our third coordinator is Anna Juncos from the University of Bristol. Maybe Anna, you briefly want to wave at people so that they can see you. And when we were preparing the bid, we also said, actually, we should not only talk about creating a community, but we should live it. And we were really delighted that we had 3 additional colleagues join us in the coordination teams. On the one hand, we have Carlos Bravo. Maybe Carlos briefly wants to wave at everyone, who was for a long time in Barcelona, but now is in Israel. Then we have Sharon, who is at Catholic University in Leuven. I don't see Sharon now, but maybe she, now I see her. Maybe she can wave too. And then we have Nick Wright with us from the UK. So we are the nucleus for now of the Relate network. But as Marianna already said, we really want to see this as an organic network, where we came up with the idea of saying, okay, let's bring people together. Let's also bring different strands of colleagues that we know together and see what we can do in the next 3 years. We also want to extend our thanks, of course, to UACES, and maybe I briefly want to give the floor to Simon Asherwood, who also kindly joined us today.
Thank you, Heidi, and thank you to the team for inviting me to speak. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Simon Asherwood. I'm the chair of UACES, so I'm apparently paying for all of this indirectly. The research networks are a really important part of UACES' work in connecting scholars in ways that are driven by their interests and their priorities. And this is a good example of that. This is an area that is very new to me. I'm interested to see what the discussion unfolds and brings, and already looking at the websites that the network set up. Well done. you can already see that there's lots of activities, including at our annual conference in Lille in September. So I want to wish the team and all of you, the whole network, a really good start to the network, and also to encourage those of you who might be thinking about this to apply for funding. Every year we have a call. If you want to discuss that with me or with any of the officers, then please just drop us a line and we're really happy to talk about it. It's not meant to be a trap, the paperwork. It's meant to be finding out how we can do something that's of real use. So with that, I will hand back to Heidi, and all the best.
Thank you very much, Simon. And again, thanks also to the whole UACES team, I think, who is always very responsive to any queries that we had and any questions. So we really appreciate also this kind of support. What can you expect today? On the one hand, Marianna already shared the link to the website, so please have a look. And also at the end of the event, we again want to talk a bit about what we have planned for the upcoming weeks, but also we really want to have this conversation of what you would be like, what you would be interested in, what you would like us, or what you would like together with us to do in the next months. The way we structured this event today is that we want to take the first 15 minutes or so to get to know each other. So not only that we share the screen, but also that we see a bit of who are the people that are now part of the network. We will then have our keynote speaker, Emilian, give us an introduction of 30 minutes, followed by a question-answer session. And at the end, the last 15-20 minutes will be reserved, as already said, to give you a bit of idea what we think our next steps could be. I'm now looking at my two colleagues, Nick and Carlos, because they prepared in the end the get to know each other session.
Good afternoon, everyone, from a grey and slightly cold Norwich in the UK. It's very nice to see you all here this afternoon. Yeah, Carlos and I get to do that bit. It's you either delight in it or you find it excruciating, which is kind of builders Zoom speed dating. And what we'd really like to do is to give you all an opportunity to briefly meet and interact with each other, get to know each other a little bit. And pedagogical tradition, I'm going to set you a task, which is to please discuss with your colleagues what a relational approach means to you. And certainly from my perspective, I'm very new to all of this, so I'm very interested in what relational studies have to say in terms of the kind of work I do on EU and national diplomacy. So what we're going to do is, in a second, Carlos is going to assign you all into breakout rooms of 3 people, and you'll have 3 minutes with your colleagues to discuss what a relational approach means to you. And then we're going to bring you back after 3 minutes and put you into another group, and we're going to do that 3 times. So we'll spend 10 minutes hopefully mixing you all up and give you an opportunity to get to know each other a little bit. And then at the very end of the session, we're going to have a broader discussion about the work that you would like the network to do, and that's an opportunity then maybe for you to bring some of your thoughts in at that point. So Carlos, can I ask you to put us all into mini breakout groups for the next 3 minutes and see what we think about what a relational approach means to us?
Thank you very much, Nick. I'll go ahead.
So welcome back to the room, and I hope you enjoyed the previous speed dating activity. I met people that I know for a while, but also new people. So I hope you also had a chance to meet new people, but also to catch up with those that you already knew. There was also a lot of excitement about relationality as a new approach, and this is why, obviously, one of the reasons that kind of motivated us to put together this research network. I would also like to join Heidi in thanking UACES, the University Association for Contemporary European Studies, for making this event, but also the research network itself possible. We wouldn't be able to do this without their support. So if you haven't joined UACES as a member, please do so, and also join other activities as well as our network. All the information is on the website. But now I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Emilian Kavalski today to give us our first keynote speech. We could not have chosen a better introduction to relational theory, given that since I'm not Emilian. He has been a pioneer of relational approaches in international relations. Before we go to his presentation, let me just briefly mention some of the highlights of his work. Emilian Kavalski is currently a professor at the Jagiellonian University, sorry for the pronunciation. Previously, he has worked at the University of Nottingham Ningbo in China, the Australian Catholic University, and the Western Sydney University. Emilian has also held research positions at numerous institutions in Asia, Europe, and North America. And he's also the book editor, series editor for Routledge, Rethinking Asia and International Relations, and the Central and West Asia regional editor for the Journal of Asian Studies Review. Emilian is currently working on the globalization and decentralization of international relations theory and practice, which will be also familiar to some of you working on European studies. In particular, he has explored the growing Asian normative orders and the way in which they interact with other established norms and institutions. And again, this is very relevant for some of us working in European studies because of the focus that European studies has placed on the US normative power. He's also worked on the encounter of international relations with life in the Anthropocene, especially in relation to non-human actors. In both of these areas, he argues that the concept and practices of relationality have important implications for the ways in which we think about the global. And it is for this reason that we have invited Emilian to come to talk to us today and to talk about what can relationality be good for in international relations and European studies. So without further ado, I'll leave you with Emilian. Emilian, whenever you're ready.
Hi, everyone. As I already indicated, it's my first time on Zoom, which I guess after 2 years of the pandemic might appear strange to many of you. So, hi, everyone. I was really happy to meet some of you already in those breakout rooms, and I look actually mostly forward to meeting most of you and having a proper conversation after the presentation. I'm also very sorry that we can't have this meeting in person, but we have to have that virtually. First, I would like to thank the organizers, Anna, Heidi, and everyone who made that network possible in the first place, and in particular for drawing attention to the many meaningful insights that relational perspectives have, can have, will have on the study of European studies generally, and I guess international relations broadly defined. Again, here, as someone who is an external observer based currently in Krakow, a city which is currently hosting over 300,000 displaced individuals from the conflicts in Ukraine, it is hard not to be moved by the social resilience demonstrated by ordinary Polish citizens who have been self-organizing in some of the most creative and meaningful ways to provide shelter, livelihood, sustenance to those Ukrainians fleeing the conflict, which for me offers a very poignant bottom-up acts of relationality rooted in such local communities of practice and resilience. And I guess Anna and some of the people who are here in the audience have written about resilience and connections to sustainable democratic practice in Europe in particular. And I think relationality and resilience and sustainability have a lot in common, and current developments even bring and make such conversations even more meaningful and much more timely. Also, for me, this experience offers an interesting qualification to the Chinese proverb that to live in times of change is a curse. For me, the current experience suggests that crisis and change are a curse only if they are lived unrelationally, and if they are not used as opportunities to overcome barriers and reach for established meetings and sustainable interactions, for establishing meaningful and sustainable interactions, which kind of like offers a segue to some of the qualifications I want to make about what I'm going to talk about today, is that most, as Anna mentioned, most of my research on relationality has been informed or preoccupied with non-Western, post-Western perspectives, and also decentering the human international relations theorizing. So in many ways, it's a move away from European studies. So I'm hoping that some of the things that I'm going to say here will be relevant to the conversations that the network, that we in the network would like to have. Actually, I find as Anna knows, is very interesting, kind of like in terms of intellectual journey and in terms of talking about relationality. We both studied European studies, basically. I moved to Canada and nobody was interested in Europe at the time when I moved there. So I started looking at Asia and quickly found that Europe was not the same actor, or European Union rather, was not the same actor as China and India at the time. And then find myself now coming back to Europe and studying Europe via China and via Chinese concepts and ideas of relationality. My second qualification here is that I see here in the audience the names of quite a few individuals whose work has actually inspired my own work, both international relations and relationality as well. So I find that what I'm going to say is repeating some of the things that some of you have already said and are familiar with. So I guess apologies in advance, and also for misrepresenting some of your ideas, I guess. And I guess the third and final qualification is that even though the title of this talk is framed as a question, I'm not sure I'm going to provide an answer to that question, or at least I'm not going to provide a definitive question to that answer. And I hope at least that it might provide a meaningful point of departure for some of the conversations some of us might want to have in the network. So I'm going to start, as I said, I'm coming to European studies, so coming back to European studies via Asia. So I'm going to start actually with what I, at the beginning of the pandemic, kind of was started as a post on WeChat, which is the Chinese social networking platform, Twitter-like, by a Chinese-born scholar based in the United States who was bemoaning the deepening fractures in Sino-American relations and especially racism as a result of this, of the racism that was coming out in the context of the framing and the discourses and narratives of the pandemic, and what she called as a loss for words. Her name is Yang Cheng, and Cheng was not merely vexed by the mutually reinforcing centrifugal forces of Beijing's growing authoritarianism on the one hand, which prevents the free exchange of ideas, both within China and between China and the world. On the other hand, the intensifying Western perception that China is either a threat to be managed or a problem to be resolved. While these dynamics have best stopped Cheng's concern, her main preoccupation really was with the disregard for the language with which knowledge, both about China but about the world generally, is produced. And as she points out, language is not just a means for communication. It's primarily an instrument of power, a measure of humanity, a map for world making. And then Cheng's call for polyphony challenges the linguistic hegemony of knowledge production, which has a lot to bear on our understanding of both international relations, what's relational in international relations, and European studies in particular. What, in this context of, she bemoans the silencing of other tongues, or rather what counts for knowledge, and who gets to define what is knowledge. As she points, is never a neutral exercise. And in her post, Cheng concludes with a very poignant, at least for me, poignant observation that, as she points, the end of the world does not arrive through water, fire, or the plague. It begins with the slow death of language, when words grow stale and complacent with power, when artificial boundaries between nations harden. A new order for our collective survival can only be born when we acquire new ways of speaking. Which kind of, for me, is what I'm trying to do with relationality, is address what I find as a similar malady of language that plagues the mainstream of international relations. So what I'm going to do is what I already indicated, is my own incursions into the spaces of relationality have been very much guided by this query of how we can remedy the malady of language of both international relations and European studies knowledge production. As I'll explain, promoting polyphony, engaging in conversation with concepts and ideas that come from outside the accepted nomenclature of disciplinary inquiry is one of the many ways in which relationality can heal the malady of language and also the disease of the imagination of IR. And I use the term healing here quite consciously and drawing particular Asian notions of healing in terms of which have transpired into global post-Western discourses on IR. So my point of departure is the claim that the mainstream international theory is defined, and European studies by extension as well, is defined as suffers from what I call a Columbus syndrome. And I'll explain that in a second, what it means. In this respect, I have tended to use relationality in a very meta-theoretical level, also instrumental sense, as a disclosure of alternative modes of theorizing, which again I have called, for lack of a better term, as an itinerant translation. However, before that, I'll just give you the context where I come from in terms of what I understand the mainstreams of the current relational terms and relational revolutions, as Emilian Kavalski has put it recently, in the study of relational international relations. I guess one of the kind of like another qualification is that, as this network already is evidence, is it's hard to overlook references to relationality in current IR discourses and European studies. However, for me, it's necessary to acknowledge that such proliferation of relational scholarship should not be misunderstood as a suggestion that there is a grand theory of relationality out there on which such accounts draw. On the contrary, there are different proponents of relationality who often have contending, if not contradictory, understandings of what they have in mind when they claim to be engaging in relational analysis. And in the absence of such unifying theory of relationality, some have suggested that the glue that binds the fragmented relational research agenda is the assertion that despite its alleged preoccupation with relations and interactions, the disciplinary study of world politics has instead tended to prioritize actors rather than relations. As such, relationality in international relations represents, as Patrick Jackson and Daniel Nexon have recently reframed it, as a family of theories, which are united by an emphasis on the theoretical and analytical significance of connections, ties, transactions, and other kind of relations. So the point here is really that relations are before actors, that we can't have actors without relations. Actors get their meaning, identity in the context of interactions. What I'd like to add, or what I try to add to that point of departure, is that for me, much of those relational projects is the acknowledgement that owing to its pervasive substantialism, international relations has struggled to foster different ways of seeing and encountering the world that can help it generate meaningful answers to the pressing questions of our times. Hence, there is an urgent need for change in perception, outlook, and vision that can help uncover new modes of thinking and doing world affairs that transcend established paradigms and practices. So this is kind of like the final qualification. So the context, so just give a position of my understanding of the current state of the art on relationality. So paradoxically, while there have been many relational approaches promoted by feminist, post-colonial, critical accounts of world affairs and European studies, for me, paradoxically, is the seminal article by Daniel Nexon and Patrick Jackson in the 1999 issue of European Journal of International Affairs that seems to pivot, or it seems to become the point of departure for much of contemporary theorizing in relationality, both in international relations, but I guess in European studies, the way I see it. And Jackson and Nexon simply contend that the bulk of international relations theory is underpinned by what they call entity seeking. And that's why they call it, regardless of their theoretical commitments, whether it's a realist, institutionalist, constructivist, whatever, all of these are instances of such a substantialist account of entity seeking, which pervades visions of the world out there as a closed system populated by sovereign states, whose interactions are motivated by power maximization, the pursuit of their own self-interest. Louisa Odysseus has labeled this quite dramatically as an ontological totalitarianism of the discipline, so this commitment to entities and entity seeking. The other paradox for me is that the main uptake of Jackson and Nexon's framework has happened in what is called, what I call broadly post-Western, non-Western global IR. I would argue that the attention to that article is not least because of that uptake and that attention to Jackson and Nexon's framework by various scholars participating in this global IR conversation, in particular in so-called Chinese IR theory. For me, relationality has thus become integral to all kinds of projects for producing worlds and knowledges otherwise. Overlapping ecological, economic, political, social crises not only suggest that the existing analytical frameworks, institutions, and types of international behavior have become dysfunctional and can no longer deal with the situation in the old ways, but that they have actively contributed to the real and epistemic violence against seeing the world otherwise. In this context, relational approaches there seek to contribute meaningfully to the decentering of international relations by outlining feasible both post-Western and non-anthropocentric modes of inquiry. On the one hand, relational perspectives yield meaningful tools for the encounter with the interplay between coloniality and indigeneity. And on the other hand, the relational move recognizes that the current ecological crises are profoundly shaped by the histories of colonialism, practices of imperial plunder, and racialized exploitation. Thus, by moving away from the substantialist universe of IR, the Relational Universe, to use the UACES Relate Network label, these approaches amplify the call for emancipatory ethics and politics, claiming what Queer Jazu labels as a more just coexistence of worlds. So that's where, this is the context in which I see my intervention, or at least I try to intervene, in this. And my first kind of move, or like what I start is my point of departure, is what I call the so-called Columbus syndrome of the discipline. So substantially, so when I call mainstream IR, basically mean what Patrick Jackson and Daniel Nexon label as substantialist IR. So I argue suffers from Columbus syndrome. As we all know, 1492, the voyage by Christopher Columbus set in motion the period of European conquest, which often is referred to in Western scholarship as Age of Discovery, and indigenous communities around the world refer to it as a period of invasion and dispossession. However, as we all know, Columbus himself failed to recognize the newness of the new world that he allegedly discovered. And what's less known is that his encounter with the various indigenous peoples was effectively prevented by his own cultural, religious, and ideological prejudices. It might appear puzzling today, but Columbus himself refused to recognize the indigenous Arawak communities spoke a language different from the one he spoke. In other words, he was not interested in translation, which would require abandoning the comfort of one's own linguistic security and treading on the shifting grounds of learning not just another language, but the other's language. And here I draw on the work of Todorov's on the Conquest of America, the question of the other, where he says that Columbus' failure to recognize the diversity of languages permits him, when he confronts a foreign tongue, only two possible and complementary forms of behavior: to acknowledge it's a language, but to refuse to believe it's different, or to acknowledge its difference, but to refuse to admit it's a language. So in this way, Columbus already knows in advance what he will find and acknowledges only the things that fit his preconceived model while ignoring the aspects that were incongruent. My claim here is that IR theory, the mainstream substantialist IR theory, and I'm aware this is an overgeneralization here, suffers from a similar condition to that of Columbus, which goes beyond the mere cognitive dissonance of this discipline. Thus, when its IR theory encounters other concepts, practices, and experience of the international, more often than not, it reverts to the prism of this Columbus syndrome. Either it recognizes them as narratives about world politics, but doesn't recognize that they're different, or acknowledges they're different, but refuses to acknowledge that they're part of world politics, the study of international relations. So they're relegated to anthropology, area studies, cultural studies, but not part of the domain of international relations. So in either case, the IR mainstream tends to prioritize ontologies of separation rather than connectedness. And this is really, for me, the real source of its Columbus syndrome. Thus, in the view of Western modernity and rationality, reality and its phenomena are assumed to be abstract, value neutral, and generalizable wholes, which are singular, out there, and defined. So some of the, again, work on resilience, particularly resilience and democratic sustainability, draws on this kind of relationality in that vein, draws in attempts to overcome those hindrances, hurdles for reaching out and overcoming those abstract notions that underpin the Columbus syndrome of theory building. So in this context, for me, relationality offers a meaningful way to rectify this trend by uncovering different modes of analytical encounter, which I have labeled, again, for lack of a better term, itinerant translation. So what I mean by itinerant translation here, this works, yeah. Okay, so let's start. So at its most basic, itinerant translation draws on a tradition of intellectual wandering, regression, and trespassing, which does not subscribe to linear logics of detachment, coherence, and parsimony. It's a relational journey of fusion, exchange, dialogue, and contestation, which does not privilege any site or mode of knowledge production, nor demand impartiality and objectivity from the theorist. In fact, theorists are creative agents, facilitating the interaction between different bodies and cultures of knowledge. They're translating and arranging the material and providing opening to worlds otherwise unthinkable, even if they are unnerving. Thus, by demonstrating that there is more than one way of seeing, hearing, and responding, theorizing as itinerant translation discloses the world as a multiversal space where alternative realities can and do coexist and have done so for quite some time. As such, itinerant translation mandates tolerance of at least as much diversity, inconsistency, and contradictions as evident in the complex entanglements of the worlds being narrated. And that's where, for me, is very interesting, is that it reminds us that IR theorizing is a sense-making process which no other than Ken Waltz reminds us is simultaneously quite distinct from the reality of world politics, of international practice of world politics. Namely, IR theories are not objective representations of the world, but as he puts them, artistic creations shaped by the taste and style of a single hand. That's the theorist. So here, thus perhaps that might seem as a radical endeavor, such positioning of relational IR theory or relational knowledge production in IR theory also acts as a reminder of the itinerant transnational nature of theorizing. Such theorizing draws on the very etymology of the term theory. In the Greek original, one of the meaning of the word theoria referred to a journey of pilgrimage, involving a willingness to travel to foreign locales that can then simultaneously inform and transform the home of the traveler. So Theoris was a traveler. He or she, mostly he, was traveling to a different place, providing a potent form of social interaction, engaging in social interactions, and itinerant performativity of such theoretical travels played an important role in shaping international relations at the time by providing opportunities for constant reframing and reconfiguration of what at the time were called interpolis relations. By extension, as the statement of the 19th century Chinese interpreter Chuti Lang from the previous page here, I think it's very illuminating, is theorizing becomes a relational process of eruptive translation that brings into dialogue the form and substance of the languages and experiences of diverse and infinitely complex worlds. Yet, in lieu of the messiness and dislocation associated with such itinerant translation, IR theory seems to recognize, again, other languages and narratives of theory building only to the extent they are arranged according to the English idiom. So I discovered this quote totally by chance in a library. There was this, actually a library in Osaka. There was this book by a Methodist preacher who was trying to study why Christianity doesn't have an uptake in Asia, and particularly in China. And the whole book, 200 plus pages, was written by different preachers, American and English. And this was the only statement by a non-European in that whole book, was in the appendix of the book, where this person and translator says that having perused the present translation of the scriptures, I find it exceedingly verbose, containing much foreign phraseology, so contrary to the usual style of our books that the Chinese cannot thoroughly understand the meaning. Now it appears to me that the present version is in Chinese words, but in many respects arranged according to the English idiom. So for me, this is actually another way of saying what the Columbus syndrome, another way of representing the Columbus syndrome of international relations, and I guess to an extension, the substantialist European studies literature, is that we fit those other narratives, these other concepts, only to the extent that they fit this preconceived narrative, the English idiom or the substantialist idiom of the discipline. So for me, such endeavor also resonates with much of what the mainstream already admits theorizing international relations is about, namely the identification, observation, explanation, and understanding of patterns by looking at the record of what happens when international actors come together in space and time. Thus, it's creativity, improvisation, rather than the provision of prescriptive or proscriptive solutions that promise to heal habits of control, manipulation, exploitation, associated with IR's insistence on the separation between subject and object, knower and known, self, other, mind, matter. Such framing for me betrays also the complex, eclectic, non-objective blend of cultural universals and culturally specific patterns of social relations underpinning the encounter with global life. In this context, theorizing as itinerant translation for me also uncovers and reflects upon the struggle to move beyond the mode of thinking governed by the logic of binary oppositions and to find a way of theorizing without being silenced by the hegemonic strength of any master narrative. And such relational theorizing, at least for me, is part of a broader effort to recuperate a much more capacious understanding of both international relations and European studies as well. So also in this context, I guess a final move for me in this itinerant translation here is overcoming a relational mode of theorizing. Also for me, I kind of like articulate here a proposition of what I've tried to engage here with some much more quantum and complex IR theory, where it reveals a much more molecular outlook, whose unit of analysis is relations rather than actors, and their multiple triadic dynamics, which open numerous points of and possibilities for interactions. In other words, here, the claim of relational theorizing as itinerant translation is that things in global life are not merely interconnected, but that they gain meaning and significance within complex webs of entanglements and encounters with others. In this context, for me, the critical contributions of such relational theorizing to these conversations is that the international, so conceived, is not merely an outcome of communicative action or solution to communicative problems, which some in European studies discourse have argued, but reflects the willingness of actors to expose themselves to the fluidity of ongoing relations with others. This engenders a rather what I call gimballed view of global life. Basically, just like a ship's compass or a gimbal, the patterns of world affairs are made up of multiple, interdependent, and constantly shifting spheres of relations. Each of these spheres represent an emergent and highly contingent nexus of complex relations, which interact simultaneously at different spatial and temporal scales. For me, the result is a multiscalar framing of global life in which diverse layers of actors and agency with the various systems, institutions, and regimes which they inhabit animate overlapping levels of contingent aggregation. The acknowledgement of such relationality, for me, reframes global life as a gimballed interface suffused with fragility and fluidity and mutuality of global interactions. And such gimballed outlook also suggests not only a radical reconsideration of the disciplinary mainstream, but it's also profoundly at odds with its underlying ontological substantialism. In this respect, the proliferation of various relational perspectives for me seeks to uncover mode for understanding, explanation, and encounter, which are not only attuned, but also able to sustain complexity, foster dynamism, encourage the cross-pollination of these disparate ideas, and engage in the plastic and heterogeneous processes that periodically overwhelm, intensify, and in fact, the trajectories of global life. The interlocutors of relationality in this context insist that rather than being fearful of analytical crossroads and the unexpected and unintended encounters that they presage, we as observers and participants in global life should embrace the uncertainties attended in the journey beyond the substantivist ontology of the world. In this way, going back to my point of departure, this talk is about the need to heal the malady of language and imagination of the substantialism that dominates the mainstream. For me, relationality points to the possibility of theoretical travels in those inescapable, ordinary, transformative, if inevitably flawed practices of translation, so often occasioned by the exposure to the unfamiliar. And in this context, I hope that all of us involved in this Relate network will not shy away from these unexpected encounters that our theoretical journeys present. It's in this way, for me, that the curious and provocative entanglements with the relationality of global life, for me at least, invokes the pluriverse of possible worlds. And that's where I end. Thank you so much for the attention, and I hope I haven't put you off with my theoretical account of relationality from studying relationality in the first place. It's much more interesting and exciting than I presented it.
Thank you so much, Emilian, for that. I mean, that was a really amazing take of your intellectual journey, also your personal kind of journey since you started in studying your PhD in the UK, and how you went on to over the past few years and come back to look at Europe and the European Union from what you learned from your encounter with Asian theorizing and Asian politics and practices. That's really interesting. I really enjoy your discussion of these itinerant translational theories and itinerant translation. And I guess, especially as European studies scholars, we struggle more, perhaps even more than international relations scholars, to move beyond the kind of the Eurocentrism that, because of the nature of our discipline, that international relations theory has suffered from. But obviously, as many people in this audience attest, we are already starting to grapple with this challenge. And I can see, or at least I would like to see, this network as taking again the metaphor of this itinerant translation or journey. We'd like to see the kind of the research network as a kind of a travel agency that will help to support and organize this journey for all of us that are very excited to engage with with relationality and with different relational approaches to international relations and to European politics and practices. So I wonder if anyone in the audience would like to start with some questions. I have my own questions, but I don't want to obviously abuse my position as a chair for this discussion. We have, I guess, at least around 20 minutes or so for discussion, Marianna. And then we have obviously some kind of concluding reflection about the network, and also we want to hear your views about what you want to do after this, and also to share with you what the next activities will be. But yes, I wonder whether anyone would like to start us with some questions for Emilian. Also, you can post on the chat if you have problems with connection or with video, etc., and I can take those questions from the chat. But obviously, in the first place, I like people to raise your hands using the Zoom options. The raise your hand thing, and I'll ask you to also to turn on your video if you don't have your videos on, and to ask yourself the question directly to Emilian. Okay, so I can see already one hand up, and again, others, please feel free to raise your hand. So I'll start with Mario. Mario, would you like to introduce yourself and also to ask your question to Emilian?
Sure. Well, my name is Mario, and I would like to thank Professor Kavalski for the interesting presentation. Also, I feel a bit nostalgic because I studied for the second year of my master at the Jagiellonian University too. And I study the European Union as a global actor in Arctic affairs. Mm-hmm. So, and I adopted a social constructivist approach to understand actorness indeed. So it's close to home. Mm-hmm. My question is, what is, in your opinion, the main problem when it comes to shifting the paradigm towards relationality, and both theoretically or pragmatically when it comes to conducting your research? Mm-hmm. That's it.
I think the main problem is that, I guess here, and I'm going to draw probably more post-colonial scholarship, is that most of us in international relations, I guess European studies, are not exposed to, for me, that's one of the main problems, is non-Western concepts and ideas in international politics. And in the sense that we don't discuss histories, ideas, normative framings that fall outside of our accepted prescribed nomenclature in international relations. So for me, this is one of the main problems. This interest in the discouragement of both students and us as scholars to go beyond the accepted narrative and these prescribed paradigms. So that's for me is the first point of, or at least the main kind of trouble or problem with accepting relationality. However, on the other hand, the growing acceptance of global IR and post-Western IR, whatever you want to call it, and its percolation in the mainstream, I think, and especially through relational frameworks, has opened such spaces. So I think there will be more and more of those engagement and possibilities. So I think the question of, but the problem here is again language. For me, that's where, how do we engage with concepts and ideas which are not necessarily, even if they, like concepts such as sovereignty, such as normative power, which China speaks of sovereignty, we speak of sovereignty, China speaks of normative power, we speak of normative power, yet the content and meaning of those concepts is very different. So one of my kind of like what I've focused on is the concept of relations in Chinese. So in Chinese, the notion of international relations is guoji guanxi. And the concept of guanxi has a very, very different etymological history than the concept of relations in English. And even though they call it international relations, which translates as international relations, users of Chinese, when they engage with that concept and they hear that they have all this etymological history, or this etymology and this history of that concept as part of that baggage. And actually in Chinese, probably relationality is probably a better translation of international relations, international relationality as opposed to international relations. So I think studying foreign languages and concepts and ideas, and I come here because my first 2 degrees are in linguistics, so my PhD is in international relations. So I'm very fascinated with words and concepts and histories of words. So I think studying more languages and linguistics and more interdisciplinary approaches to international politics be one way of redressing the problems of engaging with relationality. But I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. Sorry.
That's perfect. Thank you. That's a really good start to our discussion. I'm going to follow with Heidi.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks, Emilian. Lots to pick up on. But if you allow me, I have a very pragmatic question, because also in the breakout rooms, when I was chatting with people, I think we have a lot of people who are interested in relational approaches, but who don't really know yet how to. And I was wondering, do you have any tips for us of how to ease into this different way of thinking? Because by listening to you, it feels like a very uncomfortable journey, because you constantly have to question everything that you think about. So any do's and don'ts that you think we should keep in mind in the next month?
Well, it's uncomfortable, but also exciting in the sense that you don't know what you're going to encounter. You're not aware of what you're going to discover. I mean, again, here there is very interesting in terms of practical, because I'm interested in theory. I'm fascinated by theory and not so much by its application. I mean, I'm interested, but not so much. This is not the thing that fascinates me in international politics. But in particular, the part of the world, the part of the relationality that I've engaged with, there's a very interesting practical and pragmatic explanation of, for instance, foreign policy, bilateral foreign policy between China and Singapore, China and Taiwan, China and Japan, how relationality can explain particular patterns of relations and interactions between two and more international actors. So in this context, there is a whole body of literature already out there which pragmatically applies that in practice. Again, in Europe, people such as Emilia Kavalski and others have actually moved beyond that, how we develop much more emancipatory and much more, let's say, resilient modes of democratic governance in Europe, and also domestic and international in European affairs as well. So I think that's another way of pragmatic approach, and also more, that's another aspect that comes such as Erica Coudworth and Stephen Hobden in the UK, who work at the non-human, post-human approaches to international relations, how we can actually encounter the non-human and meaningfully engage with the challenges of living in the Anthropocene. However, again, like I guess I'm perhaps a linguist at heart. That's why I'm fascinated by language. I think our conceptual language in international politics prevents such encounter, or makes it very difficult to encounter and move on that journey meaningfully. That's why we need new concepts and new ways of speaking. That's why there was language speaking, translation is something that we need to kind of like more meaningfully engage in this substantialist IR, as I think, that's as I find it. I'm not sure, I guess. I'm not offering any pragmatic answers, Heidi, I'm sorry.
Yes, I think we can all distill some kind of do's and don'ts from that, and others that will come in the follow-up discussion. Marianna, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much, Emilian. This was already so much. I feel like I just now need to study for 3 months after this, just to be able to take it all in. But I completely see your point on language, and I mean, I'm a bit conflicted because, as Anna was saying, we are or at least I'm really looking at the foreign policy of the European Union. So I really work in the European area. And as you said, we don't really engage with a lot of non-Western literature. So even to try and challenge some of these concepts that we worked on from the substantialist tradition is, I wouldn't even know where to start. And I'm working on a paper with Heidi where we're trying to apply a relational approach to study member states' influence in council networks. And the very term of influence, I mean, we really struggle on how to define this in the first place. So I completely see where you're going. But my question had to do also with methodology. So in your experience, how, you know, how to investigate even these relations between actors? You know, is it a matter of, you know, doing linguistic or discourse analysis that you find most helpful? Or, you know, is it social network analysis that helps? Is it, or are there even sort of Eurocentric biases in the methodologies we use, right? So, I mean, just your experience in, you know, what methodologies and how we should think about methodologies when investigating social relational theories.
Right. I mean, here for me, methodologically here is actually in activist research, you know, and like action research is one way in which you can like cut across the different issues that or problems that are implicit in our Eurocentric framing of methodology. You know, I mean, the whole language of methodology already assumes that there is a appropriate way of doing research as opposed to those that are unmethodologically unruly. So I found, I mean, again, here in my own research, I try to use a lot of anthropological approaches. I find them more useful or bring them in conversation with established IR or European studies methodologies and approaches and tools for explanation and understanding. The issue here is, again, for instance, most of my research has been, so the practical, pragmatic research has been around issues of, for instance, as I mentioned, I think in one of the breakout rooms, about Belt and Road Initiative and also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and how different actors, you know, in terms of policymakers, literally interact. And part of that has percolated towards about normative power China, kind of like trying to apply the notion of normative power Europe, or, you know, which was developed for Europe to explaining and understanding China. And for me, one of the part of that being present at some of those meetings and being part or like observing as an observer those interactions was that in the context of Chinese normative power, to a certain extent we call not Chinese normative power, is that norms emerge in the context of interaction, not prior to interaction. So European Union has a set of norms framed as conditions, you know, conditionality, especially in the context of accession. For me, in the context of China, what's very interesting is that there's, you know, apart from the one China policy, for instance, what happens between actors is, or at least has been traditionally or usually, I guess, prior to Xi Jinping and the current state of affairs happens in the context of interaction. It's very, so in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative, especially in the initial stages of the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, there's some kind of policy from Beijing. However, how Costco develops that policy in Nigeria, Athens, is dependent on local interactions. It's very locally, this central policy happens, is like the connection between Beijing and the actual practical implication is dependent on local interactions. So as long as you speak the language, but the content of that language, that norm, is articulated meaningfully in the context of those interactions, it's constantly iterated in the process of interaction. That's why I emphasize communities of practice. Communities of practice are very interesting devices for explaining, for me at least, some of the initial stages of the Belt and Road Initiative and Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So again, these are very anthropological kind of approaches for me, that or ethnographic, whatever, and which of the appropriate labels. I'm not sure again if this answers your question, but this is one way, kind of bringing different language into the methodological conversation that we usually trained.
Brilliant, thanks so much for that, Emilian. I mean, I'm writing down everything because it's all very interesting to me, having also studied for a long time interactions and socialization and norms. And I have to say, mea culpa, I tend to use the kind of constructivist understanding of norms as, you know, these prior entities, or I used to, these prior entities, kind of this essentialist view of norms. So I wonder at some point, but I'm going to ask someone to ask that question, but at some point whether you can also tell us a little bit about which kind of norms did you see emerging as part of those interactions? So were you able to identify in those processes? But I'm also going to ask Nick to ask a question, so maybe you can do both at the same time. Sorry, I was not going to abuse my position. I had to ask you that question as you were mentioning that now before I forget. But yeah, I'm going to ask Nick to also ask another question, or perhaps something also linked. I don't know.
Your question was much better than mine, Anna, to be honest. But first of all, Emilian, thank you very much. It's really, really interesting. I found that the slide where you talked about IR theory as being a sense-making project, and that the quote from Waltz was, it was like, oh yeah, that makes it really, really interesting. What I was wondering though is that on your last slide you talked about a gimballed view of the world, and I was just wondering if you could maybe just say a few more words about what that means, perhaps in practice, in terms of, you know, how can we turn that into a way of thinking about and conducting sort of relational approach, for example, relational research, for example.
Nick, this is a very difficult question. So this actually draws on research on people like Robert Geyer, Elena Korostoleva, Irina Petrova from Warwick now, others who have worked on complexity thinking, complexity theory, bring it into the explanation, understanding of rational relations theory. So for me, because I kind of like intellectually, I had some involvement with that move or that tradition, so I've tried afterwards to use that, to make that knowledge useful to my relationality research. And very interesting here in the context, again, in my own intellectual experience in China, one of the most prominent Chinese IR scholar on relationalities is Qin Yaqing. There's even a book on relationality which was published with Cambridge University Press. He uses complexity. He kind of like was one of the first to bring complexity and relationalities together. So for me, this was a way to kind of conceptualize this multi-sphere, multi-layered pluriverse or multiverse, you know, of global life, what it means in practice. How, for instance, we can, I quote another paper called Inside, Outside, and Around. You know, the traditional, in international relations, we have this, you know, RBJ Walker inside-outside division, what happens inside the state and outside the state, you know, whether it impacts or not, you know, the neo debate. And I'm kind of like arguing that complexity, and to an extent also relationality, brings the around, the very context within which such inside-outside relations take place, and also how that around, be that environment, be that nature, be that culture, whatever you want to, you can put it, around is an empty vessel. You can kind of put different content in that around as a concept to explain how inside the south, how the dynamics of inside-outside relations work as a kind of like, as a variable in that explanation. And where I come from here is that I kind of like, again, I'm interested in history of ideas. So I looked at the 1920s IR literature coming from, you know, from, you know, the Aberystwyth, the first Aberystwyth school, and how it developed in terms of international politics. It was very interesting how, for instance, that's where it comes from my Anthropocene engagement, is nature was one of the variables in international politics in the 1920s. Nature was one of the actors, or one of the forces that international relations scholarships had to account for. And then something happened around the end of the Cold War, the Second World War, the beginning of the Cold War, when nature was excluded from that. So for me, what the practical, pragmatic value of such gimballed perspective on the world is to bring nature back into the explanatory system of international relations, as in terms of explanation and understanding, and also as a factor in our analysis. That's where kind of like it was very limited project in terms of how do we engage as IR scholars with the Anthropocene, with life in the Anthropocene. That's what was trying to answer. No, that's where the gimbal comes from. And I have young kids, so we used to visit a lot of museums about ships. So that's where it starts, practically and pragmatically.
Great. Evans Vanulis, would you like to ask your question to Emilian?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna. Thanks, Emilian, for a very interesting presentation. I have learned a lot. I mean, I'm definitely a novice when it comes to relationality, even though I am based in China. My question is about the theorization, because I mean, it's, as far as if I understood correctly, I mean, the relationality is about approaching international relations by considering that international relations is all about relations, right? So, and I was wondering to what extent is it that they occur some sort of ontological independence from the actors, from the political agents? So I would really like for you to flesh out a bit about relations, how they are related relations and the question of agency in the relational approach. That's my first question to you. My second question is about the normative, because I mean, as far as I understand, if I get you correctly, there is some sort of normative promise in an effort to approach international politics or European Union politics from a relational approach. What is exactly this normative promise, if you can tell us?
Okay. Oh, thank you, Evans. How much time do I have to respond to your questions? These are very, very, very good, very interesting questions. So in terms of the first question about agency, ontology, so, and here I'm going to repeat a lot of the things that Patrick Jackson and Daniel Nexon mentioned their introductory kind of salvo in terms of relationality, is that even though, as you point, international relations is allegedly a discipline about international interactions and relations, it actually says very little about relations. It says a lot about actors. That's why they say it's a very entity-seeking ontology, substantive. That's why they call it substantivism. Drawing on Charles Taylor's and others in terms of their sociological accounts of international politics. Sociological accounts of subject-object and the relations that define them. In international politics, relationality does in terms of ontology is actually puts relations first. And actors, you can't have actors without relations. It's actors emerge in the context of relations. And that point then has a lot of implication of how we conceptualize agency in international life or global life or world politics broadly defined. So on the one hand, if you put relations before actors, the fix is that each actors are different, or as some scholars, especially from Chinese IR, say we don't talk about actors' identity or actorness, we talk about roles, kind of like gesturing toward role theory. So different actors have different roles or play different roles in different interactions. So for instance, the China that interacts with the United States is a very different China from the one that interacts with the European Union, very different China from the one that interacts with Taiwan, even though it's the same actor. It's because the relations that China engages with those different actors force it to perform different roles. Also in that context, there is a time dimension here. The arrow of time comes in, is that China that interacted with the United States in the 1960s is very different China from the one that interacts today. Just as the United States is very different. So what's such, that's where it goes back to Nick's question about gimbal. You have those different space-time dimensions, but also actor dimensions. So when we engage with relational research, Patrick Jackson and Daniel Nexon and other proponents of relationality, and just drawn that, I have very little to say about it myself, is I draw on that ontology, is that relations are primary, actors are secondary, whereas international relations as we know it in the substantivist account is actors are first, and actors' identities, if you want to use constructivism, frame relations, or power, if you want to use more realist, or rules and norms, if you want more institutionalist analysis, frame what the relations actors have. So it's kind of like, I'm not sure it turns it upside down, but challenges some of this narrative. So I'm not sure if that responds to your question. So in this context, the second part of your question, the normative dimension here, the normative promise here is, again, kind of like develop a much more emancipatory form of international politics, which emancipatory in the sense that it can offer, again, going back to my thing about language, my fetish with language, offer a language that can meaningfully address the real pressing question of our times, living in Anthropocene, the increasing decoupling and separation of the world that we're seeing despite the tendency to talk about connectivity projects. Actually, all of those connectivity projects are suggesting some kind of parallel disconnections, parallel worlds that don't come in contact with one another. So the normative promise here is to kind of develop more emancipatory, democratic, equitable forms of international relations. Again, I'm not sure if that responds to your questions.
And that's great. Thank you, Emilian. I have two more questions, one more from Mario, another one from Sylvia. So I'm going to take those together because we have only a few more minutes for our Q&A. So maybe Mario, would you like to ask your question quickly?
Yeah. First, I wanted to ask you if maybe according to the Chinese or Asian Western view of relations, rather than saying that relations comes before, maybe relations are constitutive. That and also since we are talking before, you said that the main problem might be the language and the fact that we don't know also the other. It is also true that every time we label West, East, non-West, we also cover the internal differences. With the West is extremely broad when it comes to cultural academic productions, and should relational approaches and rationality not only focus toward the other, but also be more introspective, uncovering the differences maybe we are not aware of.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mario. Sylvia, would you like to ask your question quickly too?
Yes, I try to be quick. So thank you very much for the presentation. I have two short questions and maybe they live further away, but I try my chance. So my first question would be, if we talk about itinerant translation, that who would be the translators in this case? Because, for example, I'm coming from public policy sphere, and in public policy, we have policy translation, but that also often presupposes the introduction of intermediaries. So the kind of framework of who are the translator gets a bit more complicated, and I'm just trying to understand whether the itinerant translation could be paired with policy translation approaches instead of the classical policy diffusion and the other top-down approaches, in that sense that it's including exactly the communities of practices. That's question one. Question two, I would be particularly curious whether this approach and relationality would be framed or could be framed and reimagined in relation to other power theories. So, for example, how it would relate itself to soft power, dark power, short power, and the other bubbling up power theories, or would it be only conceivable in the framework of normative power? Thanks.
Thank you, Sylvia. I would just briefly, I said I was going to ask something also about obviously the Ukrainian war, and I wonder how the war is challenging also relationality in the sense of, as you were talking about, this kind of increasing disconnection. Because what we might see, obviously, is the increasing disconnection between the West and Russia and the isolation of Russia. So how can relationality and relational approaches help us to grapple with this particular challenge in the context of the war, I suppose? And also, given that, I don't think I ever engaged so much with structural realism as I am at the moment. Also, the war seems to be bringing back all these kind of classical realist geopolitics approaches. So, despite the fact that obviously one of the main challenges that we face at the moment is climate change and kind of living in the Anthropocene. So, how can relationality help us with those challenges to fight back or to push back from what we're seeing at the moment?
Well, these are all very rich questions, very interesting questions. I'm not sure I can answer them, do justice in the short period of time. So indeed, Mario, just starting with you first, that's a huge debate, especially in relational theory, if relations are co-constitutive or prior or both. And depending on different proponents, you have, so for instance, in post-Western IR, Chinese IR, non-Western IR, there is a Taiwanese scholar by the name of Chiyu, and a Japanese scholar, Kosuko Shimizu. And both of them have this huge debate about what's first. Is it relations or the relations vectors happen at the same time? And it's probably gesture towards, I can give you references to that work. So again, depending on who you're asking, they'll give you different answers. So for the way I read Jackson and Nexon, and to an extent also Emilia Kavalski, another within the European tradition of relationality, is relations are prior to actors. And some Chini and others also argue the same point, that in some of these Chinese accounts or Asian accounts of relationality, relations constitute actors. You can't have actor without relation in this context. However, what's an actor is always, in the European sense as an individual, and I as in the actor is in the community in an Asian sense. It's always, it's not an individual. So that's kind of like, it's a very different relation here, a very different point of departure. We can have a different conversation, a further conversation offline or a different meeting, Mario, really like that. Sylvia, very good questions. Again, so who is the theorist? So the way I framed it for me is the theorist is me, the scholar. I am the theorist, I'm the itinerant, I'm the one that does the interpretation. However, I'd be very curious to see how policy translation can help illuminate also in this context, the process of theorizing IR as translation. I guess they're probably a productive conversation in that, and I guess a paper or two in that, or PhD dissertation. To what extent it illuminates your second question here about, but the first question for me, as a quoting here also, the unlikely quote from Kenneth Waltz, is very subjective. We need to acknowledge that theorizing is not this abstract, parsimonious, subjective endeavor. It's a very subjective endeavor and reflects the creator, as Kenneth Waltz put it, the theorist himself or herself. In terms of power, again, here, soft normative. I mean, I use normative power simply because I came from that tradition of European studies. That's what I'm familiar with. That's why I use normative power. Of course, it can be used to eliminate other notions of power. There's this whole debate of relational power, which is very dominant in Asian and global IR theory, hasn't been able to make it so far as I know, and you're the experts here in European studies. I guess there'll be a productive conversation here between relational power and normative power, European power. That might be one conversation for this network in the future. I find very problematic here is that we often forget, and that's people in Asia don't forget, or especially in Japan, that the notion, Joseph Nye developed his notion of soft power in the context of containing Japan. We forget that Japan was the previous rising power, and that the most sold non-fiction book in the 1980s was The Coming War with Japan. How the United States is going to live in Japanese hegemony, just as now we have the Thucydides trap. How the United States is going to live in Chinese hegemony. Joseph Nye first time articulated his notion of soft power in the context of containment in Japan, that Japan would not have soft power the way the United States have, so the United States is going to maintain its hegemony. So it's very interesting, this history. So kind of like in the non-West, this history of the idea of soft power is not forgotten, even though soft power is very popular in China, which for me is very interesting. Okay, Anna, Ukraine and relationalities, and how can we explain, or what can we do? And unfortunately, I guess, I find myself at a loss of words, again, to use the quote I started the talk with. I'm on the one hand, I understand the desire to assist Ukraine in that context, but I think what is happening is kind of like it's a process of these different relationalities, or different connectivities, for lack of a better word here, that are emerging. And unfortunately, I mean, relationality can develop ways of conceptualizing bridges. I guess what you in your work have done, in Elena Krostoleva, Irina Petrova, and their joint work is about how the global is connected to the local, and actually disturbing global narratives through local practices. And in the non-Western IR theory, there is a lot about, for instance, there is very interesting about Lily Link, the late Lily Link, LHM Link. She had this work about India-China, about how border communities in India-China transform these nationalist Westphalian narratives of structural realism. So relationality allows, it's a framework which can explain global patterns, but also offers a very meaningful connection between the global and the local, in the way local practices can transform and also reimagine global patterns of relations as well, and disturb them. And then the reiteration of such global practice through communities of practice or different other forms of communal, local resilience, forms of self-organization is a way of redressing those increasingly the imposition of these new boundaries that are happening. So for me, the kind of the saving grace, or what relationality would probably draw attention to, is focus on the local again and try to disturb the global narrative through local practice. And again, going to Mario's earlier point, we're not as unified in the West. There are different Wests and there are different Easts, and I've used those concepts loosely, but I'm not imposing or assume that there is a homogeneity behind them. again, I'm not sure I'm answering your question satisfactorily, Anna, but that's kind of that's what I can do. I'm very disturbed and very troubled by the new barriers that are emerging. And again, as you know, and especially you guys know far better than me, there's the European Union's response in terms of the global gateway and Europe's Indo-Pacific strategy. They seem to contribute to such different relationalities and parallel worlds emerging rather than trying to bridge those. And the whole notion of strategic autonomy in Europe as well. While I understand the relevance of that term, it's also I'm troubled by it as well at the same time.
Thank you so much, Emilian. I mean, I think you all will agree that this was a great presentation, a great start to the network. That you dealt with so many issues. So sorry, we had to grill you with so many questions after obviously having been teaching for the whole day. So that's really appreciated how you engage with all the questions. And if anything goes in terms of how these if this is to showcase the network, I think this is a great way to demonstrate the relevance of the things that we are dealing with in the network, the types of questions that we are going to be discussing in the next months, and obviously the empirical issues and challenges that we'll also be dealing with. So thank you so much for introducing those. Thank you so much for introducing relational approaches, at least the way you understand relational approaches. Obviously, there's a lot of wealth of approaches and diversity in those approaches there. So we'll try also to deal with those differences and interactions, and also sometimes clashes between those different approaches. So thank you so much for your presentation, for being with us today. We just have a few minutes just to wrap up the network, and to also with some information for the members about how to engage and what comes next. So thank you so much, Emilian.
Thank you so much again. I really enjoyed that, and you're all welcome to Krakow. Just like hope we have another meeting here in the future.
Let's hope so. Let's hope for more face-to-face meetings. But in the meantime, I think Marianna, Heidi, Nick, and the rest of the team will also introduce you to some of the things that we are going to be doing in the next few months. So I'll leave you with I don't know who is next.
I will quickly share with you. Hopefully everybody can see this. So it's a quick summary of what's coming next. So as you can see, Sharon and Heidi are leading and organizing our reading group sessions. So maybe they can, Sharon or Heidi or both, you want to say a very quick word about our next event, which is exactly the first session of our reading group.
Yeah, sure. I can say a few words about the next session. So 11th of May, we have our first reading group session where we will be discussing some of the major texts, the major basic texts related to relationalism, and also pick in on some recent debates on relationalism, and tackle a bit further those questions which we got a taste of today, which is, what can relationalism bring to IR, but also specifically to European studies. And this is what we'll be discussing in those sessions. And I think Heidi also posted in the chat already the Eventbrite link to the first session. So please sign up and read the text with us and discuss.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Sharon. And I think, Emilian, you mentioned her a few times today. Our next discussion series session will be with Emilia Kurki. So by all means, join us for that as well. And we're going to close off in June with a second reading group session. So again, hopefully we'll familiarize ourselves. For sure, I will, with more of the social relational literature. And we've already secured 2 Relate panels at the ECPR General Conference, and then, as Simon was saying, the UACES conference in September. So if anybody's there and you have a chance to join us, please do. And we also plan, so this is still very much sort of in the works, but we plan in January 2023 to have a methods workshop. Hence my methods question to Emilian. So if you have any questions, ideas, suggestions on reading materials, you know, speakers, panel ideas, and of course, you know, other activities you would like the network to organize and things you would like to get out of the network, you know, please get in touch with any of the 6 of us, or at the email address we have there, right? relateuaces@gmail.com. And I'm just gonna stop sharing now. I see Mario, you have your hand up, so maybe you have an input right now.
Yeah, just a question. In case we found ourselves in the possibility to participate, for example, on the 11th of May, I'll be around Norway to interview people, so I might not join. In that case, what can we do?
Yeah, so as you can see today, so we're planning to record all our discussion series. And depending on, you know, whether people are comfortable, we can also record our discussion sessions for internal circulation only among the members. So I can then sort of share with you what was said. And obviously, if you have any input ahead of the, you know, reading group discussion, you know, I mean, this is really informal. So just, you know, shoot us an email, send a message ahead, or you can send your comments or your thoughts ahead. So, you know, anything that the idea of the research networks is also to be sort of as accessible as possible. And we're going to have most of our activities online, though we also hope to have at least one in person at Bristol in a couple of years. So, you know, stay tuned for that. But so, you know, by all means, you know, send us emails and we'll try and record as much as possible and share as much as possible with the network members. But I don't want to keep any of you any longer, especially Emilian, who's come out of the, you know, full day of teaching and then sort of had to enlighten us as well. So, but please, you know, we really want to make this network as useful for people as possible, and any input, suggestion, recommendations, requests, you know, also in the following days, by all means, let us know. And we really, really welcome your input. So I don't know if Anna, Heidi, Sharon, Carlos, or Nick want to add anything else before we let you go for the day.
Nothing from me, but just, again, thank you to everyone that joined the meeting. Thank you especially to Emilian for giving our keynote speech, and thank you to UACES also for supporting this network again. And obviously join UACES if you haven't done so.
Perfect. Then have a wonderful rest of the day, everybody. Thank you so much, Emilian, for joining us. Thank you, Simon, and thank you, really, everybody and our team for making this happen. Yay. So have a great day. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.